Hello and welcome to another edition of Chicago Newsroom 2.0 on CAN TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Bryant, bringing you relevant topics and the news from the week. We'll be right back with our first guest. My first guest is no stranger to the CAN TV audience. In addition to being an award-winning journalist in Chicago and through, she's the host of the wildly popular CAN TV signature program, Political Forum, a program that airs just before this one. Thank you for stopping by the Newsroom.
Well, Vaughn, I'm happy you invited me because, you don't just invite anybody to the Newsroom, but you saw fit to invite little old me, so thank you.
You're my mentor, my big little sister. You had to be here.
Well, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's so happy to have somebody else doing the news side of the important work we do here at CAN TV, so thanks for being a great partner.
Perfect. Appreciate it. So, given your experience and your perspective, why is it important to have local political shows?
So, I'm going to tell you a story. Mm-hmm. It was January 2nd, 2016, and I was asleep, and I thought I was having a dream because I kept seeing this light flashing and flashing and flashing, and I'm thinking, my goodness, this is a really profound dream I'm having. So I finally woke up from the dream about 20 minutes later, and I saw it wasn't a flashing light from a dream, it was my phone. And my phone had just been going off. I don't even know how many missed calls I had. Pick it up. Call back. I'm sorry, it's still. Mm-hmm. It was my cousin calling to tell me that another one of our cousins had been shot to death and killed. And I was stunned. It was January 2nd. We had just rung in the new year. I was, trying to, everybody, new year, new me, had all, mm-hmm. And it felt like a gut punch. So, of course, I didn't know what happened. I just knew he was dead, and my cousin didn't know what happened either. So I did like anyone else would do, and tried to Google, go online, see if I could figure out what happened to my cousin. And I'm looking, I finally find one, and a local news outlet did publish a story. I will not reveal which outlet, but they published a story, and at the end of the story, they had tagged it with the line, "Police say he was a documented gang member." And I was like, wait a second, what? No, and I want to be abundantly clear. My cousin had been a part of that culture when he was a kid, but by the time he died, he was 32 years old. He was a husband. He was a father. He had a legit job. He was not in the middle of a gang fight, right? Mm-hmm. That I knew that I knew. Mm-hmm. But that was what they had written because the police said it to them, and they just parroted that narrative without really having done their due diligence mm-hmm. as a news organization mm-hmm. and just sort of trusting the police. And the police at that point didn't know what happened either. Mm-hmm. And that much I knew, from my family. So I'm like, well, geez, why is this put out here in this awful, disparaging way about a dead person? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what really happened, and why include that if it's not relevant to his murder? Mm-hmm. Why do that?
Right.
And it was at that moment that I understood what I needed to do. I was a journalist. I was not doing this sort of work. I was not talking about politics, but I understood, Vaughn, that it is of paramount importance that the people who tell the stories, who report the news, reflect the communities mm-hmm. that they're covering. Mm-hmm. And with all the murders and gun violence in Chicago, it's so important that someone who's actually gotten that phone call at 7 o'clock in the morning is telling the stories. Mm-hmm. Somebody who's in these communities, not just to cover mayhem, who knows them, who sees the beauty, who sees the nuances, telling the stories mm-hmm. and is reporting on politics and doing it in a way that gives voice to those communities that oftentimes do not have their voices heard. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about why it's important for local politics to be included in what we're doing from this vantage point and this angle, that's why. Mm-hmm. Because people who do your work, people who've had my experience, need to make sure that we are storytellers, because there are not enough folks who have gotten that call, who have intervened in violent situations, are really speaking to the things that are happening and speaking to those communities who were impacted in a way that's helpful mm-hmm. and in a way that makes them feel like their voices are being heard and their vantage points and views are being considered. How
does that impact how you go about your work? How do you interview? How do you bring that experience to your work on a daily basis?
Well, there are a couple of things that I always try to do. And especially if we're going to be talking about the lens of violence, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the first thing that I try to keep in mind is what's missing from the story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and watching the news maybe from people who did not grow up in Chicago, who don't know Chicago, who don't love Chicago, and there's a difference between living in Chicago and loving Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Let me the way that they tell their stories, the vantage points that they cover, and then actually living here, knowing the people, loving the people, and telling the stories in that way. So what I try to do is I try to make sure that I've spent a lot of time in the communities, online with the communities, talking to people every single day, still living in the community myself. Hey, what matters to you?
Yeah.
What's important to you? What do you think of these issues? What do you think of the way the news is being reported? What do you think of that school that's being closed? And so when I get an opportunity to speak to an official, I'll say, well, you know, the people are saying that you're not in your office, you know, or the people are saying that City Hall didn't do this.
Right.
The people are saying that are these things happening, and not necessarily just trusting a narrative or talking to people who I know who may not spend a lot of time on the South Side or on the West Side in some of these distressed, depressed neighborhoods, and really giving a nuanced narrative so people who can watch our shows or watch my show can say, gee, I have always wondered that. I did talk about that in the barbershop. I did post that on Facebook, but I never thought that the politician would actually hear someone ask him in his face. You know, I never thought that the alderwoman would get called to the carpet on that on TV.
Yeah.
So that's really my approach. Like, what are these communities concerned about? But you can't do that if you're not in them, if you're only there to cover a murder.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, that makes sense. So given your experience, and then just we're obviously in an election cycle, you've had a chance to interview some of the current candidates. Like, do you have any perspective? What has that experience been like? You know, who do you like?
Yeah, well, and I want to say this too, that you should be tuned into Political Forum for sure, because we have a lot of the candidates I know the people really want to hear from on the show. And the questions that I'm trying to ask are the questions that I think people in these communities are actually interested in. And when we talk about who I like anyone who's going to sit down with me for 30 minutes and tell me the truth. So at this point, I like all of them. But I think you know, the questions to keep in mind are, what do you think the biggest issues in Chicago are at the moment? It's been interesting to hear what everyone thinks is the biggest issue.
Is there any consistency?
Yeah, public safety. And then, of course, I always ask, you know, what's your plan to fix it? You know, and everybody has given a different answer in terms of how they plan to go about fixing it. So, you know, kind of having lived here my whole life, except for the years I spent in college, knowing the city, appreciating the city, it's been fascinating to hear how people think the issues that we have are going to be resolved, to be sure. But I would say stay tuned, because those answers are all, without giving away a lot.
So outside of public safety, give me another one or two topics that have come to bear that have been consistent amongst the candidates.
Well, you know, I also like to ask about climate justice, because one of the things that we talked about, again, trying to keep the communities in mind, we talked about on Political Forum a while back, is environmental racism, right? Taking the most pollutant elements of our city and sort of strategically placing those in black and brown neighborhoods. And you say, oh, it's okay if those kids have asthma, can't breathe, you know, have all sorts of health problems in their young age. And that was kind of happening very quietly with a lot of governmental consent. So I've been asking people, what are your thoughts on climate justice? Do you have thoughts on climate justice? Do you have thoughts on environmental racism? Do you have a plan?
Okay, yeah.
Because those are things we need to know.
Right. So with that, we're going to have an election coming up. Is it February 28th? And then we're going to have a show on March 1st. Can you tell us what our plan is for covering the election?
Can I tell the people?
Yeah,
Am
absolutely.
I telling too much?
No.
Okay, so Vaughn and I are going to go live. And I don't know about Vaughn, but I love going live. So we are going to be breaking down what happened with these results. Of course, we're going to talk about the mayor's race. That's the big one, right? But we're also going to do some of these aldermanic races. You know, here in Chicago, we too have been experiencing, what do they call it, the mass resignation. People just, and we have seen a lot of aldermen like, you know what, I'm done. So there are a lot of wards with, 11, 10, 8 candidates on the ballot. So we're going to see who the new city council consists of, what these neighborhoods are feeling who they're voting for and what, if anything, changes in the city.
Yeah.
So they should be tuning in March 1st for sure, because it's going to be one.
Right, and we're going to be joined by Andrea Zopp, our chief political analyst as well.
Isn't
so there'll
she
be three
neat?
of us. Oh, absolutely.
I
We're
love
fortunate.
Andy Zopp. Yes, she's wonderful. So you're going to want to be here.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for providing your insight and giving us a good story behind why you do your work. And we'll be right back with our roundtable discussion.
Change Agents places a spotlight on critical issues impacting Chicago's communities, including homelessness, gender-based violence, food inequity, bail reform, hate crimes, police reform, school bullying, the list goes on. Each week, we'll introduce you to the community organizations and leaders who are working on the front lines to address and combat these issues. Join me for Change Agents, Thursdays at 7 p.m. on CanTV 19 and streaming live on cantv.org.
Violence is undoubtedly the most pressing issue in Chicago. That fact is most profoundly illustrated by the increased public spending coming to the city. For context, in 2007, the city, county, and state spent approximately $7 million on violence reduction. In 2022, the public sector spent approximately $118 million. The sector, now called community violence intervention, has even gotten increased attention at the federal level. Funds for CVI were included in the Biden administration's American Rescue Plan and the Build Back Better plan. Joining us today are Evelyn Diaz, president at Heartland Alliance, and Arnie Duncan, founder of Chicago Cred, creating real economic destiny. Thank you two for joining us. So Evelyn, tell us about Ready Chicago.
All right, well, I'm going to start by saying, Heartland Alliance has been around for about 135 years. We do housing, healthcare, jobs, and justice. And about 6 years ago, we saw an opportunity to do something pretty extraordinary in terms of community violence intervention, and that was really to partner with community organizations and try to implement a new program model at scale in 4 community areas that sought to find the people who were most likely to be involved in gun violence. Find them by name, by address, go knock on their doors, and offer them a program, basically a job, a paid job for 2 years, and a set of programming that also included some cognitive behavioral intervention, or think of those as therapeutic support groups. And we designed this model with our community partners, and we set out to do this. It had not been tried before. We didn't know if we were going to find the people we were looking for. We didn't know if they were going to say yes to the program offer. We didn't know if they said yes, if they were going to stick with the program. We are now 6 years in. We've served 2,200 individuals in the program. We did an evaluation with the University of Chicago and showed that the model actually has been incredibly successful at finding the right people, bringing them in, having them succeed in the program, and ultimately reducing violent crime arrests and gun violence in general. It just so happened that we were implementing Ready Chicago at a time that our partners at CRED were also implementing models, and our partners at Metropolitan Family Services were also implementing a model, but we were all really focused on how do we laser focus on the individuals most likely to be involved in gun violence and do something different than what we've normally done. We've normally come at those people with only law enforcement, only punishment. And we all had the idea that that was the wrong approach. And we all wanted to try kind of approaching that population from different angles and offering different services. So we're proud of Ready, but Ready is part of what I think of as kind of a 3-prong effort to address a population that in the past just hasn't been really well served.
And Chicago Cred?
Trying to do it quickly. It comes from a place, honestly, of real pain, but also of sort of hope and possibility. So I grew up playing basketball on the south and west sides and here in Chicago, and had a set of older friends who sort of protected me and gave me safe passage in and out of neighborhoods, and started to lose some of those friends to gun violence when I was 14, 15, 16. At that point, you didn't really have a social worker or counselor or anything. You just sort of internalize that pain, I think, and honestly, it probably shapes you and scars you in some ways that are difficult to imagine. Fast forward 20 years to run the Chicago Public Schools for 7 years, and lots I'm proud of, and happy to do that another show if you want to. We'll talk all day about successes, but on my watch during those 7.5 years, on average, we had a child, a student killed every 2 weeks due to gun violence. It was a staggering rate of loss. And going to those, my wife and I had 2 young kids then, and going to those children's homes, going to funerals, going to classrooms, so there was an empty seat, and trying to make sense of senseless to a class of traumatized kids. That was by far the hardest part of the job. Nothing else, academic achievement, budget, operations, labor management, nothing else compared. And I know we as whatever we were, parents, leaders, educators, whatever we were, we failed to keep our kids safe on the South and West Sides. So coming back to DC in 2016, this felt like the crisis facing the city. I say we're motivated by our successes, but we're haunted by our failures. And I really felt I had failed there. We collectively had failed. And so coming back and really trying to give people not a second chance, but a first chance to build positive lives, to escape those cycles of violence, there was nothing else I wanted to do.
And so what would you say you've learned over the last 5 or 6 years?
So many, man, there's so many lessons. And it's the most heartbreaking thing I've ever done. It's also the most hopeful, inspiring. But 2 lessons. One is what I just said, is that people often say it's great you're giving men and women a second chance, and I actually reject that in the vast majority of cases. I really think we're giving them a first chance, and that every institution in their life, family, school, church, nonprofits, fail to give them opportunities. I always ask our young men sort of when they get caught up in the streets, when they start, and our youngest told me he had to start making money at 9. And when you have to make money at 9, there's only one person hiring.
Yeah.
And that's one. No one is mandated to work with us. They made a rational choice at 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 or 13. Now they're making another rational choice to transform and do something else. Secondly, if you look at the backgrounds or maybe even the physical appearance of tattoos or dreads or whatever it might be of some of our young men, you might see them as the problem. I really think they're the solution to the problem. And the joy of my job and inspiration is seeing them transform, seeing them put down the guns, seeing them heal, seeing them reconcile with folks where there's been bloodshed on both sides. And they are going to lead. Our job is to walk with them and learn from them and empower them, but they are literally leading Chicago to a safer place.
Yeah, and so you talked about cognitive behavioral therapy, and there's a jobs element. Like, how have those things helped impact the lives of the people you serve?
Well, we always imagine that if we were going to come in with any kind of intervention and ask people to give 2 years of their lives to a program, there needed to be a job component to it. But all of the evidence up to that point had told us that the real thing that's going to make the difference is the cognitive behavioral interventions. And that we've heard that from our guys who've been in the program. They say, the job is nice, it keeps me coming back every day, but the thing that has been game-changing for me is the cognitive behavioral intervention. So what that is it's a group that they attend a few times a week. So they're in there with a bunch of other guys, and they're running through a curriculum, but it's designed to help them rethink how they think and slow down their thinking to make different kinds of choices. And just that process of building trust with the group, talking through some of their issues, talking through ways that they can change it, and then going out into their lives and putting that into practice, and then being able to come back and say, I was in this situation where it could have gotten really dangerous, and I knew in that moment, using what I learned in group, that I could make a different choice, and so I made that choice, and the whole thing turned out different. That those moments that they bring back to the group tell us that they're transforming their lives. And so, yeah, we're hearing from them that's been the biggest thing for them is this cognitive behavioral piece. To Arnie's point, I think one of the things that has just been most inspirational for me about this program is society really wrote these individuals off. These are the folks who get demonized in the media. These are the folks that people assume are beyond help. And we all took a different approach and said, they're not beyond help. We're just gonna meet them. We're gonna build trust. We're gonna see them differently. And just that process of really seeing somebody and seeing their greatness and seeing their special gifts the ways that they have shown up as leaders, the ways that they have shown up, their humanity has shown up, their gifts, their talents has been astonishing. And what it has really kind of, I've been in the field of social service my entire career. It's coming on 30 years. And I just felt like this is evidence that we are leaving so much talent, so much gold on the table in our communities here in Chicago. So that was really surprising and heartbreaking and inspirational, beautiful. But people need to know that. The people that think these men are beyond help, we're just really missing the mark, and we're missing an incredible opportunity.
So you guys made the strategic decision to do this in partnership with other organizations that were local to the communities. Like, tell me about the decision and how that part has worked out for you guys.
It was important because Heartland Alliance, there are certain things that we do well and certain things that we are not suited to do. And it was really clear that in order to build, to go out knocking on somebody's door, you needed to have people doing that work who know the community, who know the men that we were going to be seeking, and we didn't have those relationships. And so we knew that in order for the model to work, we would have to work with community-based organizations who know the community, who are trusted in the community, and who could hire street outreach workers who know the guys, who know the neighborhood, and so that's what started it. When we started talking to them, they had really good ideas about how to design the program. And we did that. We designed it with them. And it turns out from the evaluation that some of the things that we put in as a result of our community partner contributions turned out to be the things that made the biggest difference. For example, when guys are referred into the program from the community-based organizations, their outcomes are significantly better than somebody referred to from, a risk list, or somebody referred to who's just kind of referred to us by the corrections facilities, right? And so we really benefited from that partnership. We continue to benefit from that partnership. The whole model only works as a partnership, and I think actually that's one of the promising things about it going forward is, as long as we can have partners in every community, we can do this. We can have this model expanded in more places.
So in order to scale this work, like what kind of support do we need from the public sector? What kind of support do we need for local organizations?
Well, I think it starts with a change in mentality first, to just to build upon what Evelyn said, that really understanding what's possible and that mass incarceration hasn't worked, and I would argue has had a devastating impact on Black and brown communities, and that you've got to give folks an off-ramp to that life and give them a chance to be successful. And so once you understand that mentality, understand the capacity for transformation, the capacity for change, then you're like morally compelled to create those opportunities. So I'll just give an example. In North Lawndale, where we were all working, we were working with about 200 men and thinking we were doing a pretty good job. And USC Crime Labs came back and said, well, there are about 1,250 men acutely at risk. And so we weren't even in the game, not even 20%. So we all tried to partner and scale. And it's very early, but last year in North Lawndale, in terms of violence reduction, was down 42%. So one of our city's most violent communities was down 42%. The city was down 14%. So North Lawndale is getting better 2 to 3 times faster. It's actually driving down the city's numbers. And so again, that gives me tremendous hope that we can partner with, with other groups in other neighborhoods. If we're scaling and serving enough folks, we can dramatically, our goal has to be a radical reduction in violence, an 80% reduction in violence. And you only do that by scale. So we have to continue to get the public sector to invest. I always say public safety is a public good. And we need the private sector to stay at the table, and that those investments have been good. But I'm hopeful over the next 3, 4, 5 years, we can see the kind of reductions in Chicago that we haven't seen in my entire lifetime. And that's the fun part of this. That's the part that keeps you going. Is as hard as it is, I can totally see what's possible at scale.
Right. And what is the benefit of partnership in this work? Because, it seems from what you're saying, there's no way to do this alone.
I'll just give a couple concrete examples. So I'm going to be in Iman tomorrow morning. Iman's one of our closest partners. Iman had a green reentry program where they were taking guys who've been locked up 20, 30, 40 years and helping them. That's fantastic, but those guys had aged out of shooting. And we said, why don't we couple them with young guys who are caught in the cycles of violence and do an intergenerational program? And that's just incredibly powerful to watch and observe. And unfortunately, many of the older gentlemen lost the opportunity to really be parents and fathers to their kids because they were gone so long. But to see them take these young guys under their wing and see them learning together is incredible.
Yeah.
On the west side in Garfield Park, Marshall Hatch Sr.'s pastors have been there for decades. His son, Marshall Hatch Jr., had a vision for doing a residential program and having guys live on campus together. And seeing that come together. We started our work in Roseland. I had no history of them. There was a Mr. and Mrs. Jones. Everyone kept talking about the Youth Peace Center. I always say these two individuals walk on water. They had other careers. They had devoted their lives to helping the community. And to see a strong married couple devoting themselves to that community. Our first cohort of 25 guys, probably half of them came from YPC. So there's those partners, their creativity, their ingenuity, they're willing to be humble and do this. We all share data. We all share successes and failures. That makes all of us better. Makes all of us better. We can't do it without them.
Yeah, man, we're out of time. I'm actually disappointed that we're out of time. But thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Arnie, for joining us. Hopefully you'll come back and join us at some point because we have to keep this conversation going. We'll be back with my final thought. We are all horrified by the murder of Tyree Nichols, which took place January 7th in Memphis, Tennessee. He was brutally beaten by 5 Memphis police officers who are also black. He died 3 days later. This tragedy reinforces that challenges with law enforcement are cultural and systemic in nature, and that regardless of race, bad behaviors are supported and fester in toxic environments. A step in the right direction was taken when Police Chief Sarah Lynn Davis, both the first black and female police chief in the city of Memphis, fired all 5 officers involved with the Nichols case. Not only has the investigation failed to find probable cause, I predict, and I hope I'm wrong, that the root of this incident was a personal conflict between Nichols and one of the officers, making this a true abuse of power. I'll be back here again next week, amplifying community voices and analyzing the news that matters to Chicagoans. Until then, good night.